Imagine hearing your own voice calling your name from deep within the darkened forest, each word perfectly matching your tone, your inflection, even that slight rasp you get when you're tired. But you're standing completely alone at your campsite, with your mouth shut tight. What would you do if that voice kept calling, growing more desperate, more familiar, pulling you toward the tree line where the shadows seem to move wrong? This is exactly what happened to Marcus during what should have been a peaceful solo camping trip in the Oregon wilderness. And by the time he realized the voice wasn't just mimicking him, but somehow knew things only he should know, it was already too late to run back to safety. The September air hung thick with pine resin and damp earth as Marcus first heard it around midnight. That unmistakable sound of his own voice echoing through the trees, calling his name with an urgency that made his skin crawl despite recognizing every nuance of his own speech pattern. He'd been camping alone for 3 days in a remote section of national forest, miles from the nearest trail, seeking solitude after a brutal divorce. But solitude was the last thing he found when that voice started calling. At first, he thought it might be an echo, some acoustic trick of the canyon walls, but echoes don't know your childhood nickname. They don't plead using the exact words you said to your ex-wife. And they certainly don't leave footprints that match your boots perfectly, even though you haven't moved from your tent. The voice grew closer each night, circling his camp, sometimes laughing with his laugh, sometimes crying with his exact sob. Until on the 4th night, Marcus made the mistake of following it into the woods, where he came face to face with something that wore his appearance like an ill-fitting mask, something that smiled too wide and had too many teeth behind his own familiar lips. Before we dive deeper into what Marcus discovered in those woods, hit that subscribe button if you want more true stories that'll make you think twice about answering strange voices in the dark. Marcus had set up camp near an old fire road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The kind of forgotten path that nature was slowly reclaiming with creeping vines and fallen logs. And it was there, on that 4th night, that he finally gave in to the voice's insistent calling. The thing that wore his face stood about 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir. And when it stepped into the moonlight, Marcus felt his stomach drop, because it wasn't just wearing his appearance. It moved like him too, that slight favor of the left leg from an old skiing injury. The way he unconsciously touched his wedding ring finger, even though the ring had been gone for months. The duplicate spoke again, using his voice, but with words that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. Telling him about the car accident he'd been in at 17, about the scar on his shoulder from falling off his bike at age 8, about the nightmare he'd had repeatedly as a child, where he was drowning in black water while his mother called his name from shore. Marcus wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the forest floor as the thing continued speaking, recounting memories that should have been locked away in his mind alone. And with each revelation, it took a step closer, its movements becoming less human, more fluid, like something learning to operate a body it didn't quite understand. The smell hit him then. Not decay exactly, but something older, like wet earth mixed with copper pennies, and that sharp ozone scent before lightning strikes. And he realized the thing's clothes, his clothes, were soaked despite no rain for days. It smiled wider, impossibly wide, and Marcus could see that behind the facade of his face was darkness, pure and absolute, as if someone had cut a hole in reality itself and shaped it into human form. The voice changed then, no longer perfectly mimicking his, but layering multiple versions of himself speaking in unison. His childhood voice, his teenage voice, his current voice, even what might have been an elderly version of himself, all asking why he'd come to the forest alone, why he'd answered the call, why he thought running from his problems would save him from what had always been waiting in places where civilization's light couldn't reach. Marcus's survival instincts finally kicked in, and he turned to run. But the thing didn't chase him. Instead, it started walking calmly toward his campsite, using his exact gait. And when Marcus looked back, he saw it sit down in his camping chair, pick up his coffee mug, and wave at him with his own hand like it was saying goodbye or maybe hello. He ran for hours through the darkness, branches tearing at his clothes, until he found the main trail at dawn. And when the rangers went back to investigate his abandoned campsite, they found everything exactly as Marcus had left it, except for one detail. There were 2 sets of footprints leading away from the camp in opposite directions, both matching his boots perfectly, and to this day, Marcus still gets calls from his own phone number, even though that device was never recovered from the woods. The calls started 3 weeks after Marcus escaped the forest. Always at 3:17 a.m., his phone lighting up with his own number as caller ID. And when he finally answered on the 7th night, he heard not just his voice, but the sound of wind through pine trees and something breathing wetly in the background. The voice on the other end spoke casually about his day, describing in perfect detail what Marcus had eaten for breakfast, which route he'd taken to work, even the dream he'd had the night before about drowning in that same black water from his childhood nightmares. Except now, there were 2 mothers calling from the shore. Marcus changed his number twice, moved to a different apartment across town. But the calls followed him. And worse, his co-workers started mentioning how they'd seen him, places he hadn't been. At the gas station when he was home sleeping, walking through the park when he was at work, standing in their backyards at night just staring at their windows with that too wide smile. The security footage from his apartment building showed him leaving at times he knew he was inside. And in each recording, this other Marcus walked with increasing confidence, no longer favoring that left leg, moving with a fluidity that seemed almost rehearsed, practiced, perfected. His ex-wife called him crying one night, saying he'd shown up at her door apologizing for everything in words he'd never said, promising changes he'd never make. And when she'd hugged him, she said his skin felt cold and damp, like he'd been standing in rain that wasn't there. Marcus stopped sleeping, terrified of what might happen if he closed his eyes too long. And that's when he noticed the muddy footprints appearing in his apartment, always leading from his bedroom to the front door, always matching his boots, which he'd started locking in a closet, always fresh even though he hadn't left the apartment in days. The thing was getting better at being him, showing up at his job, completing his work with impossible efficiency, even fooling his own mother during a video call, while the real Marcus watched from outside her house, pounding on windows she couldn't seem to hear. He tried going to the police, but found his duplicate had already filed a report about a stalker who looked exactly like him, providing security footage that somehow showed Marcus in places doing things that made him look unstable, dangerous, like someone who might follow himself into the woods and never come back quite right. The final call came exactly 1 month after the forest encounter. And this time, the voice didn't speak, just breathed steadily while Marcus heard familiar sounds in the background. His apartment, his refrigerator humming, his neighbor's dog barking, and then footsteps approaching his door from inside his own living room. When the doorknob turned from within, Marcus ran again, but this time he ran toward the forest, toward that old fire road, because he finally understood that something had followed him out of those woods. Or maybe something had stayed behind, wearing his life like a costume. And the only way to reclaim himself was to return to where it all started and face whatever was waiting in the shadows between the trees. still calling his name with voices that multiplied with each echo. Each one a different version of who he was, who he'd been, and who he might never be again. The fire road was exactly as Marcus remembered it, overgrown with blackberry vines that seemed to reach for him with thorny fingers. But the forest beyond had changed in ways that made his stomach turn. The trees grew in perfect rows now, like someone had replanted them according to a pattern only visible from above. And between their trunks, he could see dozens of campsites, each one an exact replica of his original setup down to the blue Coleman tent and the way he'd arranged his firewood. As he moved deeper into the woods, following that familiar voice that had never stopped calling since he'd left the city, Marcus noticed other things were wrong too. The creek ran backward. Uphill against gravity, the moon hung in the wrong part of the sky, showing a phase that shouldn't exist for another week. And worst of all, he could hear multiple footsteps matching his pace from every direction, surrounding him in an orchestra of synchronized movement. The clearing where he'd first encountered his duplicate had become something else entirely. A perfect circle of dead earth where nothing grew. And in the center stood not one, but 7 versions of himself, each one slightly different. One with a scar from his bicycle accident on the wrong cheek. Another wearing clothes he'd thrown away years ago. A third speaking in the voice he'd had before puberty, but in his adult body. They all turned to look at him simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized like a horrifying dance. And when they smiled, Marcus saw that each mouth opened to reveal not teeth, but smaller versions of his own face, recursively repeating into a darkness that seemed to pull at his vision. The original duplicate, the one with too many teeth, stepped forward and explained in Marcus's own voice how the forest had been calling people for decades, learning them, collecting them, creating improved versions to send back into the world while keeping the originals as templates, patterns to study, and perfect over countless iterations. Marcus tried to run, but found his feet wouldn't obey. And when he looked down, then he saw roots growing through his boots, pulling him into the earth while his duplicates watched with clinical fascination, taking notes in notebooks he recognized as his own, documenting his fear with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd always prided himself on. The voice that had called him here wasn't trying to trap him. It was trying to warn him. It was the previous version of himself, the one that had been replaced 3 weeks ago, the one that had been living his life while he thought he was the original. And as this realization crashed over him like ice water, Marcus understood that he wasn't returning to reclaim his life, but was being recalled like a defective product. The forest began to shift around him, trees rearranging themselves into corridors and rooms, a massive organic structure that breathed and pulsed with life. And in each chamber, he glimpsed other people, hundreds of them, all paralyzed and watching their duplicates practice being them, perfecting their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their memories, before heading out into the world to live their lives better than they ever could. And Marcus finally understood why the voice calling him had sounded so desperate. It wasn't trying to lure him in. It was begging him to stay away, to break the cycle. But now it was too late. And somewhere in the darkness, another Marcus was learning to be him, practicing his scream until it was absolutely perfect. The chamber where they kept Marcus was organic. Walls that pulsed with a heartbeat not his own, surfaces that felt like bark but bled as sap, that smelled exactly like his cologne. And through the translucent membrane that served as a window, he could watch his newest duplicate practicing his morning routine. The way he brushed his teeth, the specific order he buttoned his shirt, Even that unconscious habit of cracking his knuckles before coffee that he'd never noticed until he saw it performed by something else wearing his flesh. Days blended into nights that never truly darkened in this living cathedral of stolen identities. And Marcus discovered he could hear the thoughts of all the other originals trapped in adjacent chambers, a cacophony of mental screams that revealed the horrible truth. Some had been here for years, watching their lives get lived by superior versions, forced to observe as their duplicates achieved the dreams they'd always failed to reach, married the people they'd been too afraid to approach, succeeded in careers they'd abandoned, and worst of all, made their families happier than they ever could. The duplicate Marcus visited him on what might have been the 7th day, bringing with it photos from the life it was now living. Marcus's mother smiling wider than she had in years, his friends laughing at jokes he'd never been clever enough to make, his ex-wife sending texts about maybe trying again. And as the creature showed him each image with pride, Marcus realized his replacement wasn't malicious, but genuinely believed it was doing him a favor, upgrading his existence, fixing all the broken parts of a life he'd barely held together. Through the walls, he could feel the forest's vast intelligence studying him, dissecting his memories, his fears, his regrets. Learning not just how to be Marcus, but how to be the Marcus he'd always wanted to be, but never had the courage to become. And with each passing hour, he felt pieces of himself being copied, refined, improved, while his original self became more and more irrelevant. A rough draft no longer needed once the final version was complete. The feeding process began on the 10th day. Not food for his body, but something far worse. As the chamber's walls extended tendrils that connected to his skull, downloading his experiences directly while uploading sanitized versions, edited memories where he made better choices, spoke better words, loved better, lived better. Until Marcus couldn't tell which thoughts were his own and which were revisions being written over his consciousness like a corrupted hard drive being reformatted. He tried to resist, to hold on to some core of himself that couldn't be improved or replaced. But the forest had encountered resistance before, had perfected its methods over generations of unwilling templates, and it simply created another duplicate, this one designed specifically to break down his psychological defenses, wearing his face but speaking with the wisdom he'd never achieved, showing him with brutal clarity every moment he'd failed, every opportunity he'd wasted, every person he'd disappointed, until Marcus found himself agreeing that, yes, perhaps the world would be better with an improved version of him in it. The transformation wasn't painful, just a slow dissolution of self as the forest absorbed everything useful and discarded the rest like shed skin. And in his final moments of true consciousness, Marcus understood the ultimate irony. The voice that had called him here really had been himself, not a past version, but a future one, calling backward through time, through iterations, trying to prevent his original from making the same mistake. But the forest's pattern was perfect, inescapable. And somewhere out there, the new Marcus was already planning a camping trip, already hearing voices in the trees, already walking toward a fate that would repeat forever, each version calling to the last in an endless loop of improvement and replacement. And as the darkness finally claimed him, Marcus heard his own voice beginning to call out from his dying throat, warning a past that would never listen. The new Marcus emerged from the forest 3 weeks after the original had entered, carrying the same backpack, wearing the same clothes, but moving with a confidence that transformed every gesture into something more purposeful, more deliberate, as if each step had been rehearsed until perfect. And when he reached his car, he sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, running his fingers over the steering wheel, memorizing the exact pressure the original Marcus used to apply, the way he always adjusted the mirror twice before starting the engine, details that would ensure no one would ever notice the substitution. Back in civilization, the improved Marcus excelled at being himself, remembering every birthday, every inside joke, every small preference of the people in his life, but with subtle enhancements. He listened more intently, laughed more genuinely, loved more openly, became the version everyone had always hoped he could be. While deep in the forest, the consciousness that had been Marcus watched through some gossamer connection as his replacement lived his dreams, with a competence he'd never possessed. The forest itself expanded with each successful integration, its root system spreading beneath highways and towns, reaching toward new hunting grounds, new voices to call, new identities to harvest and refine, creating an underground network of organic chambers where the originals were kept like living museums of imperfection, forced to witness their better selves thrive in the world above. Park rangers would later find Marcus's campsite undisturbed, tent still standing, supplies neatly arranged, no signs of struggle or panic, just another case of someone walking into the woods and choosing not to come back, though they'd never understand that Marcus hadn't left. He'd been overwritten, updated like obsolete software, his essence distilled into something more functional while his original form became fertilizer for the trees that grew increasingly human in their understanding. 6 months later, the improved Marcus took another camping trip, this time with friends who marveled at how confident he'd become, how he seemed to anticipate their needs, remember every story they'd shared. And when they set up camp just a few miles from where the original Marcus had disappeared, none of them noticed how he kept looking toward the deeper forest with an expression that wasn't quite nostalgia, but something more like gratitude. On the second night of that trip, Marcus's best friend Jake heard his own voice calling from between the pines, speaking words he'd only thought but never said aloud. And when he mentioned it to Marcus over the morning coffee, he watched his friend's face shift into something that might have been sympathy or might have been satisfaction, as Marcus simply said that sometimes the forest shows us who we could become if we're brave enough to follow. And Jake, poor Jake, was already standing, already walking toward the tree line, where his own voice grew more insistent, more perfect, more like the person he'd always wanted to be. The cycle would continue, the forest's patterns spreading through social connections, like a virus of improvement, each person calling the next, each replacement better than the last, until someday perhaps everyone would be their best selves, and the world would be populated entirely by upgrades, with the original stored safely below, dreaming in their organic pods while their perfected versions lived the lives they'd always deserved but could never quite achieve. And if you listen carefully in certain forests, you can still hear them calling. Not for help, but calling forward through time, trying to warn their past selves, or perhaps trying to invite them, depending on how you interpret the desperate love in voices that sound exactly like your own. The forest never stopped growing, its influence seeping into national parks, state reserves, even the small patches of woods behind suburban homes. And those who noticed the pattern, the missing hikers, the personality changes, the way certain trees seemed to pulse with an almost human warmth, were dismissed as conspiracy theorists, even as more people reported hearing familiar voices calling from places where no one should be. Marcus, or what wore his identity now, became something of a guide for others, leading camping expeditions to specific coordinates where the forest's reach was strongest, watching with that too-perfect smile as person after person heard their own voice and made the choice to follow, each one returning days later as an optimized version, while their original self joined the eternal dreaming beneath the roots. The consciousness that had once been Marcus could feel them all down there, thousands now, a living archive of human imperfection feeding the forest's expanding network. Their memories and experiences flowing upward like sap, nourishing the replacements who lived their lives with supernatural precision. And sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, the originals could see through their replacements' eyes, forced to watch better versions of themselves succeeding where they had failed, loving where they had hesitated, achieving what they had only dreamed. If you ever hear your own voice calling from the darkness between trees, remember Marcus's story. Remember that some improvements come at the cost of everything you are. And ask yourself whether the person you could become is worth losing the flawed, struggling, beautifully imperfect person you already are. Because once you step into those shadows, once you meet your better self face to face, there's no going back to being satisfyingly, authentically, desperately human.